So, I've spent a lot of time getting to know Jack, and I wish we had a lot more time today, but there's a lot of your story that folks don't know. I think it might be helpful for them to hear it. I thought one of the first questions would be, tell us how you got started in high tech and what inspired you to go that direction.
Well, I was sort of a engineer, scientist, tinkerer, even junior high school. I loved fixing things, making things work, and chemistry, physics, and techie stuff. So that was the early origin of that stuff. But I was very insecure, laid-back kind of kid, and it took me a long time to hit my stride. When I got to college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, so I decided to change my major every semester and try them all out. So I started out as a Chem E, and then EE, and then physics, and then math, and then by that time I was senior, so I said maybe pre-med, and finally they just said, Jack, take an engineering chemistry degree and get you out of here. And I still wasn't sure about my career path. So, electrical engineering undergrad and organic chemistry are two very different technologies. But if you had to pick two that's the most ubiquitous, most powerfully enabling, maybe those would be the two. Because there's electrical engineering, computer science, microprocessors. There's more hardware than that than anything else on the planet. And that's the importance of that. And if you look at organic chemistry, it's the basis of all life. So, it turned out to be a great combination to go to a place like Silicon Valley.
So how did that lead you to starting your first company, and what gave you the confidence to do it?
Well, I got recruited to a venture-backed startup. It was about 5 years old, doing 10 million in sales. It was in the scientific instrument area. And I got recruited there because their products were frankly junky. They worked, but you almost had to be an engineer to keep them going. But you had to be a scientist to know what to do with them, and I was able to buy a lot of those and fix them. So I got hired into the head of R&D role for that company. But the founder was a cantankerous scientist who was brilliant, and he had taken the company from $10,000 of startup capital only to up to 10 million in sales. And then he realized he can't take it the next leg. So he was smart enough to know he was a lousy manager. So he brought in 5 guys like me. 2 of them were PhD scientists, 2 were Harvard MBAs, and a 5th one was a Chinese-American salesman. And so we were able as a team to take that company the next leg from 10 million in revenues to about 300. And so for me, that was like earning the MBA from School of Hard Knocks, which was very powerful, and you remember those lessons. Now, here's the answer to your question. So I was head of R&D. I was driving the development of all the new products, new categories. And a close friend of mine, the Harvard MBA finance guy, he said, Jack, you're never going to get rewarded for what you're doing. These are your inventions, and that's driving our growth. But we came too late to own a major piece of this company. He says, you should get out of here and found your own company. And so that's what I did.
And so with your first company, tell us about the outcome. How did the partners do? How did your investors do?
Well, that's the first company I founded when I was 31 years old. I married Linda Gill about that same time. 6 months later, I quit a high-paying general management job. Her father thought I was a real flake, and
Does he still?
If he were here, he might give a more balanced perspective. So I founded my first firm. I invented a thing called a computing integrator. This is something that looks like a desktop PC. So it's a desktop computer with keyboard, built-in printer, microprocessor based. We were the first in the world to bring microprocessors to market in a commercial market. I picked 3 other founders, 2 from Hewlett-Packard, 1 a German national to run European sales, 1 to run US sales, and a 4th one was a techie engineer from HP. Well, we were very fortunate with minimal capitalization. We went sort of 0 to 100 million in about 4 years, and then to about 200 million over the next 2 or 3. But then I figured out it's a long process to take a company public. You had to get numbers up into 100 million plus to be a candidate. And so along came an opportunity to merge this into another company called Spectrophysics, which by that time had emerged as the world's largest laser company, gone public, and was on a big time roll. But they had suffered some product reliability issues, and the stock had bombed off from $32 all the way back down to $4 per share. And that's the time we made our deal with them. So my reasoning was, our earnings and growth will enhance their results, but more importantly, we'll also ride the curve back up as restore profitability. So it turned out hugely profitable. All of us, Autolab was the company name, founders did well, and we added about 300 million or so to spectrophysics market value. So for a young guy, that was a good shot in the arm to keep going.
So who were your early mentors?
Early mentors. Well, we've mentioned one here already, three of them already. Burt McMurtry, I'll never forget meeting him the first time. He was a laser scientist at Sylvania, and a very smart and savvy guy, Rice undergrad, Stanford PhD. And he was on the verge of creating his first venture capital firm. And again, he was the one that brought Microsoft and Sun to the marketplace. So Burt was this really compelling, smart, charming, caring kind of person. When you meet people like that in life and you want to have them as a mentor, what I had learned is you want to tell them you love them, you want to hang out like them, you want to be their best friend, you want to be like them when you grow up, and you kind of put them yourself in as many places as they're going to be and find some way to earn them to take an interest in you. Burt was one of those, wonderful guy. Sadly, we lost him just a couple of months ago. Gene Kleiner was maybe my favorite of the bunch. He was a Brooklyn Polytech PhD engineering. His father was an immigrant. And he's one of these hands-on kind of guys. So, if you were a tinkerer and an engineer, he's the guy you had to love. But he was just smarter than hell, and he knew how to win over young entrepreneurs, and that was a big part of Kleiner Perkins' early success, was Gene Kleiner's sensitive approach to mentoring. Tom Perkins was my other one, and he actually was more the mentor on the marketing side and the strategy side and all those kinds of things. But I was very blessed to have people of that quality as mentors.
And so why did you decide to jump from the startup and the entrepreneurial side into the venture capital side? And who were your early investors?
Well, that's a real important question, big question. If you're a hands-on company founder, technologist, inventing product, founding companies, bringing it to market, you're an operating guy, a CEO, a founder. Most people like that gig better than venture capital or anything else. So most people who pursue a career in that direction rarely will get off of that train and jump on a venture capitalist. But again, what I had learned through these great mentors was, Jack, if you like that, why not raise some money and you can do 10 of them at a time? And so then I got lucky and thought about that, and that's when I found Dr. David Ramler, who was a key scientist at Syntex Corp, which is the big biopharmaceutical company that brought birth control pills to the marketplace, enormously successful and profitable, unbelievably exotic structure, 5 European scientists with a company headquartered in Mexico City, a research headquarters in Palo Alto. Amazing company, but just a stable full of unbelievable, super bright and successful people. So I was lucky to be able to get David Ramler to leave that and join me to found Vanguard.
So you had a tremendous success at Vanguard over 20 years. Why would you give all that up and move on?
Why would you walk away? That's the biggest question of all. I think because about that time I'm age 50-something. And even though I'm sort of top of the game and Vanguard ranks among the top performing venture capital firms, it was not hard to not notice, that those guys right behind you are younger, smarter, better educated, leaner, and more willing to work longer and harder. And I'm thinking, why do I want to keep in this race? They're going to run all over me. And so an appropriate happy exit or transition was sort of the notions I had. Problem is, you're so busy you don't have time to think about what the next era is. So you got to get out of there to have some time to think. And so I made a decision to walk away. I brought in a new generation of 3 young partners, told them here's keys to a golden franchise. I'm going to wish you luck. I'm out of here. I may come back, may not. But you're the one with all the relationships with the people who give you money to play the game. So you have to be engaged. And I didn't have a plan. I just knew I wanted to free up some time. If I had any notion of a plan, it was probably to teach over at Stanford in sciences or engineering.
Well, so my understanding is you went from there and developed some entrepreneurism courses for Stanford and Berkeley, and then subsequently went to Harvard, MIT. What's the secret sauce to teaching entrepreneurism?
That's something we give an awful lot of thought to, and I'll just tell one important story. Intel was founded in 1968. So somewhere around 72, 3, 4, I was sitting at Stanford Graduate School of Business one late Friday afternoon having a beer with 4 professors. And one of them said, you know, Intel is going to be a spectacular success. It's only 3 or 4 years old. It's already hitting 100 million in revenues. Why don't we design a course for teaching engineers how to be entrepreneurs just in the semiconductor industry? Now that's a pretty narrow focus. The second Stanford business professor said, I like that idea, but look, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's go see what Harvard has. You know, they have all these great 40-page case studies that they invest a lot of money to create. Then the third professor says, well, wait a moment. You know, it takes a professor or 2 and 5 graduate students or postdocs about 3 to 4 years to create one of those great case studies. And if you're Intel and you're growing 100% a year, in 4 years' time, you won't even resemble the Intel you are today. So that would be sort of old, worthless information. And then the fourth Stanford GSB professor, who happened to be my bachelor roommate and ultimately best man in my wedding, he said, well, screw all those paper case studies. Why don't we just call Robert Noyce or Gordon Moore, Intel founders, have one of them come over here and talk to our students and tell us how they created Intel. So what was born at that moment, I think, Brian, is a new teaching methodology, which is, we call it live ongoing case studies told by the founders themselves. Now, ultimately, I came to appreciate there are 2 kinds of people that teach entrepreneur courses, and both are very important. In business schools, we have the tenure-based full-time faculty who teach you things like fundamentals of finance and accounting, fundamentals of marketing, and global distribution, and general management, and all these what we call core topics. But I truly believe that the best teachers of entrepreneurship are real-world entrepreneurs, like the Steve Jobs of the world. Now, it turns out they're the busiest people in the world and not easy to get to come to the classroom. But if your name is Stanford, and Apple headquarters is 12 minutes away, and if you know Steve Jobs personally and you suck up and tell him how great he is all the time and make friends with him, you might get him to come over twice a year to talk to your Stanford students. But will you ever get Steve Jobs to come to Chicago or Houston or New York? No, he's too busy, right? So it's a rare opportunity, but it takes a lot of effort and organized plan to get these great entrepreneurs to want to spend time in the classroom. So Stanford made a lot of effort pioneering how to do that, and I was a part of that. And so I love that. And that's why I got excited when Harvard approached me and said, Jack, would you bring some of this, quote, West Coast teaching methodology to conservative, traditional Harvard? I thought that was mission impossible, frankly. But I decided to give it a shot, and that's how I made that transition.
Okay, so let's talk about the innovation district. It's one of the top primary topics for today. You've established your credibility. You saw what happened over, I guess, 25 years in the Silicon Valley. And you keep talking about the need for teaching entrepreneurism. Can you talk a little bit more about what can Rice do to accelerate that education process?
Well, I can give you a perspective and then make a comment. I think it was President Malcolm Gill who, as a Rice leader, first recognized the opportunity for collaborative programs in general, and he was a big supporter of collaborative programs with the Texas Med Center entities, Baylor College of Medicine, UT Health, MD Anderson, and so on. He was also a big fan and supporter of people like Professor Steve Corral, and endowed a chair, the SICK chair, which he jointly held in engineering. So Steve was one of those early players. At that time, there were 3 very senior Jones School faculty members, Steve Corral, Ed Williams, and Al Napier. So that was a pretty sizable stable for a smaller university like Rice. Steve got recruited away. Al and Ed both retired, and so we were down to 0. And one of the things I did was always go over and hammer on the dean of Jones School of Business about we need more entrepreneur professors around here. Well, we finally got a great one, but we're one. right now. We were 3 10 years ago, we're now 1. So I think we're underinvested in core entrepreneur full-time faculty for one thing, and I know Professor Holberg has presented proposals to help remedy that. But it turns out these kind of people are the most in demand. Every great biz school wants more of them, so the ticket is high. So there are fewer candidates and rich prices to get any of them. So it is definitely a recruiting challenge. But I think that's the first thing we need. But now in the meantime, going back to my Stanford experience, it was professors of the practice, which is a fancy title for somewhere halfway between, full-time faculty and, what we call adjuncts on the other extreme. But professors of practice are usually more senior people, more often than not paid faculty on a part-time basis, and they bring their real-world experience in. So I think it takes 2 to tango, and I think we need to do a lot more of that here at Rice.
So Rice is highly ranked in entrepreneurism now, and you've spoken a lot about Steve. And could you talk a little bit about what, I guess he helped found the Rice Alliance, the Rice Business Plan competition with you guys. Talk a little bit about why that was important in the history of that.
Well, Steve came here somewhere in the late 90s, I think it was. I didn't know him well until 2004. And I think he was the first to advocate joining these national emerging organizations like incubators, accelerators, and appendages of biz schools that have an arm's length relationship. So the Rice Alliance of Technology and Entrepreneurship. So I got to know Steve somewhere around 2003 and 4, and one day he came to see me and said, "Jack, my Rice Business Plan competition has just been ranked number 10, and we're only a 5-year-old program." He says, "If I can go from startup to top 10 in 3 or 4 years, why can't I be number 1 or top 3? I said, "You could." And so we got into a conversation about what steps it would take. So on a big whiteboard in my office, we made a list of the top 7 programs at that time, which were UT Austin's Moot Corp, Carnegie Mellon, MIT 50K program, and 3 or 4 others. Then we added Rice as a column, and we said, okay, what are the metrics by how you measure a great biz plan competition? So number 1 is access to compete. Number 2 is process of competition. Number 3 is quality of the judges. Number 4 is size of prizes. Number 5 is a kind of mentoring and so forth you can do with them. So we went through every one of those and brainstormed a sort of a leapfrog strategy. And Steve was so engaging that he just loved being able to do this with what he called real-world entrepreneur. Well, when we got down to the size of prizes, at that time, UT Austin's Moot Court was a $100,000 prize. But if you won the competition, you could only collect the prize if you moved your company to Austin. So it had strings attached. So I said to Steve, in this case, here's an easy one to fix. All we have to do is have a prize of 100,000 or more with no strings attached. And he laughed and he said, well, look, Jack, I'm milking all my donors, all I can, for all I can get out of them already, and I just can't go easily find another 100,000. And by that time of day, he's getting along, and I want to wrap up. And I said, well, sure, Steve, it's easy to fix. All you have to do is find 5 more guys as dumb as I am, and you divide 100,000 by 6, it's 16,000, and maybe that'll make it easy. He said, that's a great idea. Who do we call next? So we called Rod Canyon, a friend of mine, who had founded Compaq Computers, one of the most successful companies in the history of the world in terms of startup. Fastest from startup to Fortune 5, fastest startup to $1 billion in revenues, and fastest from startup to $10 billion in revenues. And Rod's a very smart, street-savvy kind of player, so he joined us in this discussion, and that's how we created the Goose Society to provide a $100,000 no-strings-attached prize for the Rice Biz Plan competition. Well, unfortunately, for Rice, Professor Corral got so well known by all these bold moves, and they grew a lot of attention. And he was well supported, of course, by President Gillis first and President Lieberman second about the importance of entrepreneurship. That's why he got recruited away. And I had become sort of his mentor, and he'd come to me every month with 3 more offers he had to think through about whether he should stay or go. So he's had a rather storied career. We need more guys like that on Dean Rodriguez faculty, and again, the only barrier is the cost of getting the best ones.
So we hear a lot about Ignite, Inventure, Global Consortium of Entrepreneurial Centers. I think a lot of the folks in these rooms have heard of these. Can you tell us a little bit about each one of those and what's their contribution to creating this ecosystem?
Okay, well, through Steve Corral, I became sort of, I was appointed by Dean Gill Whitaker, then Dean Glick, to be chairman of the Rice Alliance Senior Advisory Board. So Brett and I became good friends and developed a close working relationship. When Dean Gill Whitaker retired, was about the same time President Gillis stepped down, and the provost also moved. Brad came to me, he said, Jack, I'm in deep trouble. He says, my three biggest champions, President Gillis, the provost, and Dean Whitaker, are all leaving or retiring. He said, I'm going to be hung out to dry out here. And I gave him a kind of a Silicon Valley answer. I said, look, Brad, a new dean is coming. His name is Bill Glick. It takes a new dean about 2 years to figure out who's on first, what their priorities are, and going into action. And I said, while they're doing that, we're just going to have a great time and go up market and, excuse me, Peter, do whatever the hell we want.
He's nodding. He's agreeing with you.
And so that's how Brad and I started a beautiful relationship. And so we recruited a very senior advisory board. I was just amazed. Brad Burke had joined Steve to be the insider chief operating officer of all of Steve's activities. But when Steve left, Brad truly stepped up to the bar, a whole new level of engagement and leadership and performance. And we were very lucky to have him in place. And so we went from a dozen corporate sponsors to 180 or something like that almost overnight. And the reputation of the BizPlan competition took off big time. And the Goose Prize gave a lot of weight to that, by being a big attraction to come here and win the big prize. And so the first winners in the Rice BizPlan competition starting in 06 was UCLA, Dartmouth, UT Austin, Johns Hopkins, a bunch of heavy hitter, great institutions. So I just want to go on record as saying what a fabulous job Brad Burke has done in delivering the leadership.
So you mentioned a little bit about the contribution that Goose is making. Can you talk a little bit about what makes Goose different as an angel network investor? How are they different from the other groups in town?
Okay, before I do that, I realized I didn't answer your second question. I just wanted to point out one thing. You asked about the Ignite. This is another program I was able to bring here that I created at another university. But the whole idea goes back to the real entrepreneurs teaching real entrepreneur courses. We used to say at Stanford, putting Steve Jobs in a classroom is magic. I mean, he had a great story called Apple to tell. He was a powerful storyteller. You're going to be seduced out of your wits and get in line to work for Apple, if you listen to him speak. But now, as we said, that was wonderful for Stanford, but you can't get him to come to Rice or U Chicago or some other school. He's just too busy. So another university engaged me and said, would you help these hotshot young new entrepreneurial professors? So I was trying to think of what would help them most. And this happened to be Indiana University Bloomington, where I did my doctorate. They hired in the early 2000s some really hotshot senior new faculty. But none of them had any real world experience in either the Boston or Silicon Valley community. So when I was asked to go meet them, I was thinking, what single thing could do most to help them? And so the notion popped in my mind about, okay, if we can't get Steve Jobs or somebody like that to come to Bloomington to talk to our students, then let's just bundle up the students and take them where Steve is. So what was born is what we call a spring break trek, T-R-E-K, to Silicon Valley. So the formula is simple. Every spring we raise 50, 60, 70,000 bucks from donors. We pick the 50 best and brightest MBA students, PhD students in science, MD students, and so on. We take them to the host school, and in the past, Stanford and Berkeley and UC Davis have all been host schools for us. And on day one, we put them on a bus, and we go visit a bunch of hotshot startup companies. So companies like Google and Tesla Motors and Yahoo and HP and Stanford even. And so day one, it's kind of a kick the tires and Silicon Valley bus tours. Day 2 and 3, we put them in a classroom like this, and every hour on the hour, another great entrepreneur comes in and tell their story. It's hugely inspirational, and the students love it. Many of them say, single best experience of my whole academic time. So with that experience of creating that program in Bloomington, we brought it here, and Brad and I worked to refine it and take it another notch. So we're now in our 9th year, is it, Brad? And we made UC Davis our permanent partner, because Stanford is too full of itself to be a very useful, involved partner for us. Don't quote me with my friends. Berkeley is rapidly getting to the same point, so they have the good fortune of being right in the middle of and on the edge of Silicon Valley. Davis is 25, 30 minutes up the road, and they're a little more leaner and meaner and hungrier, so make a great partner. Besides the fact that Professor Steve Corral was Dean of Business there, which helped us. So last year we took 70 students from Rice Business, Rice Engineering, Rice Sciences, Rice BioE, from med schools across the street, UT Health and MD Anderson and Baylor College of Medicine, and some from University of Houston, UTMB in Galveston, and Lamar University. And it was a phenomenal experience. I think it's one of our most successful, what we call flagship programs in the Rice Alliance. So that's the Ignite. Now come back, you got ahead of me.
I was asking about Goose and the impact. And what makes Goose different than the other angel investment groups?
Okay, when I first started spending a little time in Houston, going back 20 plus years ago, I guess people were intrigued, what's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist doing down here, you know? So for that reason, I got a lot of speaking opportunities. And I'll never forget the first half a dozen, because City of Houston had a sort of Chamber of Commerce task force trying to invent a thing called an incubator, which later was founded as a thing called Houston Tech Center. I went to half a dozen breakfasts over River Oaks Country Club with 50 to 70 people in a room, and it was clearly evident that doctors, lawyers, and accountants and bureaucrats don't know how to do these things. So after about 6 meetings, I was kind of had my fill of that. So in a sort of a brazen, smart-ass kind of thing, I stood up and I said, look, I don't know any successful enterprise ever founded by bureaucrats, lawyers, or accountants in the tech world. Therefore, we don't have the right people here to guide this organization, so I'm out of here. I said, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you a challenge grant. I'll put up the first $25,000 if you'll find 9 more who'll do same. And now we got $250,000. We'll go hire us a great CEO to run this thing, and I'll be a player. And we hired a guy named Paul Frizon, who was a founding president of Houston Tech Center. And that led somewhat to Goose supporting like activities. They brought in a huge number of companies, but now back to your answer for Goose. Houston had a dearth of venture capitalists and angel investors, especially angel investors. There are almost none. So back to those pioneering days with Professor Corral, we decided to create Goose, which is youngly retired or semi-retired entrepreneurs who are willing to invest in startups, but more importantly, invest in mentoring and helping them. So the Goose membership requirements are people like that who have money on their hands, time on their hands, and a style and willingness to mentor. Initially, there were 6 of us, and then we expanded from 6 to 9 to 12 to 15 to 20, now 25. So again, back to my last couple of slides, we have 25 members worth something more than 10 billion, but more importantly, incredible number of years of experience, and all of them willing to mentor young entrepreneurs. So that's what sets us apart. So in fact, the real answer is our contacts, our relationships, our experience, and our Rolodex is probably worth more than the money that we invest in these young startups.
So 2 final questions. I think a lot of the folks in this audience want to know, if we enhance the ecosystem for innovation in Houston, how does it affect Houston, how does it affect Rice, and how does it affect all of the faculty that are in this room?
Well, I think it presents a new opportunity for about 3 or 4 major things. I think of Caltech as the analogy. Caltech was a lot like Rice and about the same size, a couple of decades ago, 3 decades ago. It was smart enough to figure out that there's going to be a huge cash flow when President Kennedy says in 1961, was it, right here on the Rice campus, we're going to the moon in this decade. Followed one hell of a lot of very big government contracts for hardware and space development and computer systems and all that kind of stuff. And Caltech had a major program to garner a big share of that, which is why they enjoy the position. So it was a focused effort to go after DoD grants to help the space program. That was hugely important. So number one, I think Rice is at the right place, right time, right now with President Lieberman's leadership and all the great developments across the street at Texas Med Center, and particularly now with this new Sears property acquisition. You know, that's less than a mile or so away from here. And if that project is executed right, which I think it can with a lot of your help, that can be a blockbuster as big, if not bigger, than that whole TMC complex. But now let me tell you, if we don't do it right, I think Rice will be lost in the dust compared to the momentum that's building over there. Professor Bobby Robbins parachuted in here 7 years ago, helped create a major master plan. You've probably all seen the building that's shaped like a DNA molecule. That's a $400 million collaborative building. Right on the edge of the medical campus. Then he persuaded all the big entities like Methodist and UT Health and MD Anderson and Texas A&M and Baylor to put their next big research buildings up next to that. So if you add up that $400 million for the collaborative building and anywhere from $200 to $300 million for each of those research buildings, that adds up to over $2 billion. Let me tell you, that is all in major momentum over there, ground being broken, financing in place. It is going to be amazing what happens. If we don't, now that's all focused on life sciences. Rice's and Midtown's big opportunity with all its partners is to do the same thing for all other areas of entrepreneurship and technology other than life sciences. So again, my statement is this can be as big, if not bigger, than that whole TMC complex, and that's a $2 billion investment. So right place, right time for Rice and Rice leadership, thanks to David's taking personal leadership of these major initiatives. But what's it going to do for faculty is another part of your question. I think if you look at research faculty who create a lot of IP, a lot of patents, a lot of disclosures, we can see that turn up 2x, 3x. Let me just tell you a short story about another conservative institution that shows you what can happen. When I went to Harvard in year 2000, I got in trouble by saying at some public event for which I was told not for publication or for repeat. But my first impression was Harvard was more like an 18th century British university than a 21st century American university, meaning Harvard style versus Stanford. Well, they didn't like to hear that. But I was recruited by the provost and the dean of medicine, and they wanted me to say that, and they wanted me to talk about the kind of stuff we talked about here tonight. The first guy we hired in a big program there was a PhD scientist with a JD and an MBA who had worked for Johnson & Johnson for 30 or so years. He was very expensive. His job was to go around to all of Harvard Med School faculty and the 5 teaching hospitals of Harvard Med and to work with young faculty members and teach them how to conduct good lab notebooks, how to write up disclosures, how to write up patent applications, and create all that IP. So one guy working that turf full-time around the Harvard Med system, which was 2,203 faculty members and a whole lot more clinical faculty, we turned up the IP directed towards the tech transfer office 500%, 5x in 3 years' time with a focused effort. I think we can do things like that here, and that'll make a huge contribution.
Well, I think we got to jump. Paul's over there squirming. So I think the panel is getting started. Hopefully, we've got a few other questions, but hopefully we'll get to them later. Good job. Thank you.
How about a round of applause?